In this segment on our journey through the global marketplace, we deliver one of the topics that's most fun and closest to my heart, and that's the idea of distribution and supply chain management. Why do I spend special time on this other than that's my particular area of interest, international distribution? It's because you'll see as you go to different countries, it's probably without a doubt the most manifest difference in actually doing business in another country. The number of middlemen, how manufacturers and suppliers behave, the relationships that they have, where you're allowed to locate, constraints on where you're allowed to locate, the movement and infrastructure of goods. That is undoubtedly the most manifest difference in international business and, in fact, in international marketing. I've been in the international marketplace now for about 15 years, and I can tell you there are stark differences that I don't even profess to fully understand. I understand them in some markets, but even then it's very much a prima facie understanding because there's always layers and layers and layers, and there are dynamics of the marketplace. If you look at infrastructure development, for instance, in a very unusual country like Chile, even though there's not a lot of physical distribution, all transactions go through banking centers in Chile because Santiago is a financial infrastructure for much of Latin America, even more so than Sao Paulo in Brazil. Even though Citigroup would argue at that point, we have empirical evidence to support it. If you look at a Japanese distribution system, it's a good example of these vast market differences between what we're accustomed to as U.S. companies. There's a high density of middlemen, and it's based on the Keiretsu structure in Japan. So you have a lot of middlemen in Japan, and everybody thinks, well, Japan's a very direct system. It's actually the exact opposite. The middleman power is within the middle, whereas in the U.S., all the power is on the ends, either in the manufacturer or on the customer side. We like to think customer, but sometimes the manufacturers. But the middlemen are always squeezed out and usually have, they're arguing for margins. They have the lowest power in the entire exchange process. There's a lot of differences in terms of channel control. High levels of control because of the Keiretsu or the chaebol in Korea, which has government at the core as opposed to a bank at the core. That channel control is financially anchored in Japan, and in the U.S., it's relationally anchored. In Korea, it's government or public sector anchored. Now, some changes are taking place, but as you go to different marketplaces, you can see the notion of who controls the channel is so vastly different. The notion of the middleman having so much power within the Keiretsu is markedly different than what we're accustomed to in the U.S., where it tends to be skewed on either end of the channel. And in fact, those kind of differences play a very, very important role in some of the other things we talked about, like negotiation processes, strategic alliances, legalistic and jurisdictional issues that are confronted by international business executives. Even business philosophy is obviously different in Japan than it is in the U.S. The long-term orientation is very different than our stock market quarterly orientation that's prevalent in the New York Stock Exchange or the NASDAQ systems. Our SEC operates under different rules and reporting norms than they do in Japan. The long-term orientation in Germany, in fact, precluded BMW from becoming a part of our U.S. stock market system for many years because they couldn't or wouldn't want to comply with a lot of SEC standards. And in fact, many of those standards were changed to accommodate more international involvement in our local markets. The notion of very large-scale retail store laws, and we talked about legal codes and norms, and its successor, those generational affiliations that go back to Guangxi. They have a similar system in Japan. There are successors, and there are movements, and there are also transition plans that are often generationally tied. They're decades in advance of what we usually have in the U.S., where somebody's fired and then they're looking for a new leader or a new regime for the organization. And a lot of changes are affected just by how they go about accounting for goods and services in the marketplace. When you compare distribution channels in the U.S. and Japan, you see there's a big difference. And in fact, some would argue it's the reason why Japanese automakers have been so globally successful, that in fact they define under the quality, the total quality initiatives and TQM, they define a lot of the close relationships, the interwoven relationships that were more governed throughout the supply chain. Warehouse distributors, jobbers, mass merchandisers, and so forth are very impacted by these changes. When we talk about large-scale retail store laws, in Japan they protect the small retailer. It's very different than the U.S., where the Walmarts, the big boxes and can come in like Home Depot and Lowe's and generally govern and command a marketplace based on, market savvy. In Japan, there's an overt effort to protect the small retailer. That's true in many, many countries where entrepreneurship is a lot different than it is in the U.S. So they have prefectural governments, and the whole idea of townships and cities and prefectural governments play a preeminent role in how they protect the individual companies. In fact, it's true in Argentina. If you look at Buenos Aires proper, when Walmart came into the marketplace, there are constraints on what Walmart's allowed to sell and what they're not allowed to sell. And there are protectionist movements in place in almost all parts of the world for the small retailer. Japanese supermarkets, they did emerge for 10 years, and they're in critically bad financial, they're economically depressed, and many of them are being acquired. It took 3 years for Toys R Us to come into Japan, but the fate of Toys R Us in the U.S. There are licenses to operate, and that licensure requirement in countries like Japan and India are vastly different. And full-service stores, they need 39 different licenses. So for instance, when Hooters opened up in Shanghai in China, they could sell food, then they could sell drink, that was a separate license. To sell apparel, a separate license. So it's very different than the U.S. And Japan has a lot of licensing that's required, especially as you go more and more full service in retail organizations. Their consumer philosophy of harmony and friendship, they're not conflict-ridden like many Western cultures. The consumer tends to be very brand loyal. We think we invented brand loyalty in the U.S. Go to Japan. Service and quality play a major role over price in the Japanese system, and they make small and frequent purchases. Okay, they're not stocking up, and some of that has to do with the infrastructure of Japan. But there are a lot of patterns that happen in a global marketplace. When we talk about middlemen services, the breadth of different product and channel lines, cost and margins, very different, channel length, block channels, how much stock is on hand, safety stock, JIT and JIT2, the notion of power and competition. A lot of companies globally, one of the movements that's happening is cutting out this middleman, thinking that there's more economic efficiency and effectiveness. But that's gone in different directions at different times. There are different retail patterns in terms of the numbers of outlets, and that's part of protecting the small retailer in many marketplaces. But when we talk about home country going to foreign countries, the most important thing you need to remember about channels is that channel systems are not transportable. Sometimes a channel system that's very effective in the U.S. may not be effective in Europe or Asia Pacific or Latin America or the sub-Saharan region for all the reasons that we discussed earlier in the semester. So you can't think that you can have a uniform channel structure in any market. And some of that, in fact, is often governed by the home country. There are global retailers out there, export management companies, trading companies, foreign trading companies, manufacturers, export agents, home country brokers. We won't go into the intricacies of those, but keep this in mind. As we go to different types of channel structures, remember that they all play a major function. If you look at Li & Fung, one of the largest trading companies in the world, what are they today? I mean, what is a trading company? Are they a global retailer? Are they an export management company? Are they a middleman in a sense of, a broker? Are they agents? They're probably something different. So if you take Tesco versus Walmart versus a German company like Merck, I mean, they all use Li & Fung very differently. A lot of the apparel companies like the Gap, so if you're a manufacturer, you use them very differently than Dayton Hudson uses Li & Fung, but they play a role in connecting. And the best way of thinking about it is that these trading companies, all these delineations of different brokers, agents, export management companies, Now they've all kind of crossed over, and they're all very much hybrids. Even the jobbers and the dealers that we think about are extending their value-added service provisions, and that's becoming kind of a global trend. So that's one area where we see a great deal of convergence in channel choices. But there are a lot of factors that affect what channel you're going to use. Obviously cost, how much capital is necessary, the control, the coverage, character, and continuity. And we call these the 6 C's: cost, capital, control, coverage, character, and continuity, the extent to which you can sustain that relationship. When we develop channel relationships, we have to locate those middlemen. And in fact, many of them are foreign-owned subsidiaries. Select the middlemen through screening, intensive screening. The wrong middleman can sink your market entry strategy. Then it comes the whole idea of how do you motivate these middlemen? Is it done with margin? Is it done with other incentives? And then how you control them once they're in the marketplace. I have many clients we have used middlemen, and they basically ripped off intellectual property, or they had other agreements with same type manufacturers, repackaging the goods under different names and selling in the same market, so competing with their customer. And that's very prevalent. And in some countries, it's not illegal. So you can't always rely on the, kind of the infrastructure of common law. One of the phenomena that's happened in channels that we'll talk more about, and we've been talking throughout the semester, is the notion of the business-to-business internet. That is playing a fundamental role in changing the whole nature of channels. It reduces procurement cost. It makes it easiest to find the cheapest supplier. W.C. Benton made a very interesting observation. He said, what is this notion of outsourcing? We source from wherever we get the best deal, whatever's effective. Who came up with this idea of putting the out before sourcing? Because sourcing has always been a global part of doing business, especially in a more and more globalized marketplace. But cutting the cost of processing transactions is something that's become a reality, not only with the global oligopolistic markets within the financial sectors, but also with the internet being able to process transactions without currency float. And we talked about that as well. It also makes it very, very possible to have a greater and greater control over your inventory cost, reducing stock, the whole notion of JIT, JIT2, reducing the costs and the capital associated with dormant stock and cycles of production. At the same time, in closing, there are a lot of e-vendor concerns that relate to channel management in the global marketplace. Issues like culture, issues of translation, especially when it comes to packaging, local contacts, where they've been, what their history is, what kind of, we talked about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. How does that impact your agents, brokers, intermediaries? For years, companies have been using agents and non-employed intermediaries because if they have to offer an incentive, which we might think of as a bribe, they don't want anything to do with it. So by having an independent, non-employed middleman, they essentially say, okay, the agent does whatever is necessary. We don't want anything to do with it. It's a way of circumventing a lot of the spirit of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. How you conduct payments. And those payments, while internet transactions have made a smooth processing, there are also hackers and security measures that underlie many of the concerns of e-vendors. Delivery, there's still physical delivery. We can't make products and services come out of a computer. So the logistics and physical distribution that underlie a lot of these transactions. And finally, promotion, whether they're sales incentives or advertising or other promotional techniques, how they're governed through e-vendors and the internet. Thank you.